Yeah, you look good, Norm.
Is that any better? No.
Hey, everybody on YouTube and Zoom. We'll get started here about 60 seconds and look forward to our conversation today. Norm, Goose, you guys ready?
Yes,
Ready.
sir.
Okay, just want to welcome everybody to the USA Hockey webinar series presented by BioSteel and Pure Hockey. We got two great guests on today, former teammates at the University of Minnesota-Duluth Bulldogs, D partners. So, they always had each other's backs. We have Guy Goslin, who is our ADM regional manager, and he's actually a two-time Olympian and has coached our sled hockey team for quite a number of years. But now he's just, this past winter, he worked with our youth Olympic team for our 15-year-olds. And that was, hopefully Guy talks a little bit about that great experience. And then really have a pleasure to have on Norm Maciver from the Chicago Blackhawks. He had 12 seasons in the NHL, three-time All-American at UMD because of Goose. So you could probably thank Goose for those All-Americans. And then he was a Hobey Baker finalist. And he just finished up his 13th season with the Chicago Blackhawks, 3 Stanley Cups. And his roles have varied. He was assistant coach prior to his time with Chicago. But then with his time in Chicago, worked in player development, player personnel, and now as assistant general manager. So Goose and Norm, the show is all yours. Remember, if you have a question, put it in the Q&A box or on YouTube, on the YouTube live chat. So thanks, guys.
Hi, Norman. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, Goose.
All right, brother. Thanks for coming on today. Really appreciate it. And let me set the record straight here, by the way. I was lucky to be on the ice with Norm. So thanks for the compliment, David. But anyways, Norm had a fantastic career. He's still involved in the game. And we've known each other for about 38 years now. So that's a long time. Anyways, going back, a little personal stuff here. Casual conversation in hockey development. So going back to UMD days, I got a couple things to ask you about it. First time we met, you're walking into the dorm. We're both freshmen, and you're carrying some stuff in, and you have a Bobby Orr VHS. And I'll always remember that because I thought that was a little bit different, but didn't find out, what the significance of that was until just a couple of years ago. But can you explain that a little bit to the fans out there, Norm?
Well, I was a defenseman growing up, and obviously growing up in the 1970s. And I was an offensive defenseman. And if you're going to be an offensive defenseman in the 1970s, there was only one guy to try to follow and emulate, and that was obviously Bobby Orr. And so he to be honest with you, Goose, he wasn't my favorite player growing up was Guy Lafleur, but he was a forward with the Montreal Canadiens. But I just, Bobby Orr was kind of like during that time as I was growing up, and he's probably the greatest player of all time. And I just loved watching the video. I mean, I literally would watch it all the time, and it was amazing. Every time I watched it, I seemed to be able to, I thought I could pick something up out of that video and try to implement it in my game. Obviously, never coming anywhere near that, but at least it was something I loved watching it. It was sort of motivational, inspirational. And I used it kind of as a teaching and learning tool. Just anything that I could pick up. It was amazing just watching it as many times as I did. I always sort of felt like, oh, there's something I hadn't seen before. So I just, he was an amazing player, and I just loved watching him play. And I didn't get to see him play live much because he retired. I mean, on TV, he basically retired when I was, you and I were probably about 10 or 11 years old. So we didn't really, I don't remember the best of him. So the VHS tape was a lot of those highlights, and it was a good opportunity just to see how good he really was.
So how long did that stick with you? How long were you watching the VHS?
I was watching those. I would watch them probably my first year and a half in the NHL. Now, I only obviously at home games. I couldn't bring it on the road. Didn't have a VCR to watch it, but certainly at all the home games, I like to just throw it in there. It was about 25 minutes long, and then watch it, and then head on to the rink, and just sort of a little bit of inspiration and motivation to, like, okay, see what I can do out there, and try to envision some of those things that I saw in the video.
That's awesome. Next thing that I felt was a little bit different. When you came in, you used a straight stick. Can you tell us some stories about your straight bladed stick?
Yeah, well, I think it started, I might have been in Bantam hockey. And I think my dad just one day said, you should try playing right-handed. I'm naturally, I shoot left. I am right-handed, but obviously I shoot left. And he said, it'd be kind of neat if you could play both hands. And so he got this idea. And up until then, I had probably used a little bit of a curve on my stick. I mean, when you're whatever, 8, 9, 10, 11 years old, I'm sure you got a little curve because you want to be able to raise the puck. And then suddenly when I was in Bantam, I went to a straight stick, trying to see if I could learn to play right-handed. And, it was frustrating to try to, I mean, it was hard, obviously, to try to do. And, I was telling you before, Goose, I would, when I would go play shinny or skate on the outdoor rinks, depending on who I was playing against, I would sometimes try to practice right-handed, depending on the level of the competition. But I never could really master it to the point where I felt comfortable doing it in a game, other than maybe taking a shot. But it was just something to try. And, I think also because I felt like maybe I could stick hand a little bit better with it. But after my freshman year at UMD, where I only scored 1 goal and realized I couldn't shoot the puck with that stick, I finally switched to a curve my sophomore year.
That's awesome. Would you be comfortable telling the story about what happened in Hartford?
Oh, so yeah, so I'm sure everyone knows. Obviously, everyone knows who Gordie Howe is, and Gordie Howe was ambidextrous, meaning he could shoot equally as well right or left-handed. Probably could have played as well either hand. And I had just gotten traded to the Whalers, and Gordie was working for the Whalers in some capacity. I don't know if he was like an ambassador or just sort of I'm not really sure exactly what he was doing. And but we had played a game one night, and it was early on after I got traded there, and I hadn't met Gordie before. And a situation happened in the game where I was playing the right defense, and left shot playing the right defense. And in the offensive blue line, the puck comes around on the boards on my backhand. And rather than stopping it on my backhand, I just kind of switched hands real quick to stop the puck, keep it into the blue line, and just I just threw a wrist shot towards the net. And, nothing happened. But so after the game, I'm in my locker and I'm just getting changed. And I see Gordie Howe come in the dressing room, and I was like, I'd never met him before. It was pretty cool. And all of a sudden, next thing you know, he's like walking right towards me. And I was like, dang, and he comes over and he just stops, shakes my hand. He said, "Hey, I really like that play you made at the blue line." I was like, wow, he noticed that. I was like, that's pretty cool. So that was pretty cool that Gordie actually saw that. And I was always hoping to be able to score a goal right-handed in the game. And I had one chance towards the end of my career off a rebound on my backhand. I tried to switch hands and shoot it, but I missed the net. But I never was able to score a goal right-handed. I tried.
That's awesome. That's awesome. So again, when you came to Duluth for the first time back in the early 80s, um, I'm going to be generous here and say that you weighed about 150 pounds.
That's being generous. Yeah.
Yep. Can you, you started as a freshman. I think you're freshman of the year that year. Anyways, had a great season, but you want to talk a little bit about navigating at 150 pounds and um, your approach to the game at that weight?
Well, yeah, I'd always been undersized growing up, so it's just something that I was used to. I never thought of it really any different. It's just, play the game the way I've always played the game. So I wasn't never really worried about the size of the other guys. Obviously, I realized later on that I needed to get a lot bigger and stronger if I was ever going to play to reach the level I wanted to get to in the NHL. But back then, it was just sort of something that I was accustomed to doing, and all the way growing up as a kid, like we didn't have AAA programs when I grew up. Everything was house league. I played house league really all the way till junior hockey, because growing up in Thunder Bay, there was no AAA hockey. It's a pretty isolated area of Northern Ontario, so there's not like a lot of areas you can go travel and play. So everything's right there in Thunder Bay. So they just basically split everybody up and you just played against each other. So, I was always kind of the kid that had the puck a lot, and if you get the puck, people are going to try to hit you. So you just kind of figure out how to do it, and that's the way I always kind of approach it. So coming to UMD, I didn't think it was any different.
So getting creative outside now, you're telling me about the different ages of the people that you used to play against out at the park and with the junior teams.
Well, the junior team was kind of interesting because, so at the time in Thunder Bay, this would have been like 1981, 82. We didn't have a junior league. We made a junior team, but we didn't have a league to play in. It was a few years later that Thunder Bay actually did join the USHL. And I think I don't remember how many years they were in the USHL, but I know it was at least 15, possibly 20. And they had some good teams. But when I was there, we had no league to play in. So in order for us to have games, they locally made a league for us to play in. And it consisted of the university team, which still played in their university league, Canadian University League. And, these were guys basically between the ages of 21 and 26. And then in Canada in the 1970s, senior hockey was really big. And senior hockey was just, it's basically men's hockey. These guys aren't getting paid, but, they take it obviously very seriously, no different than American Hockey League, NHL. And the Allen Cup was a big trophy in Canada. And so Thunder Bay had always had a strong senior team. And so that year, they still had the one local senior team, and they made another senior team. So there's two senior teams, and the four of us played in a league. Now, the senior team consisted of guys. There was one player who was in his mid-30s who had played 12 years in the NHL. There was other guys that had played 10 years of pro hockey that were, late 20s, early 30s. Combined on the two teams, there was probably, I would say, more than a dozen players that had pro experience, whether it was the NHL, WHA, American Hockey League, International League. And so as a 17-year-old, and you're playing against men that have actually played against the best players in the world, it was pretty cool. It was a pretty cool experience. And I said this to you earlier, Goose, that when I got to college my first year in the WCHA, it was just like, I didn't really think it was that. I knew it was really good, but the players, I'd played against really good players the year before, older players. And so it wasn't that, I just didn't think it was that big a deal, because that experience of having to play against those men, and, they weren't taking it easy on us. They played us, it was a very competitive league, and they played us hard, but it was just a great experience. You learn so much. Like, I remember one of my neighbors, he's about 10 years older than me, and he had been a star junior player in the Ontario Hockey League and a scoring champion. And his career had wound down, and he came back to Thunder Bay and he played on one of those senior teams. And I just remember playing against him. It was like, I'm playing against a really good player here. And I remember if I was on the bench, I would always watch him and you know, just learn things that he was doing. And it happened to be just a great experience. Very fortunate the way it turned out.
Awesome. Good story. Moving on, talk about your team at UMD. You had some really good hockey players that you had an opportunity to play with. Bill Watson, Brett Hall, Tom Curvers, Matt Christensen. You know, those guys were all in your era. Many, many more. Can you tell me what you know, a takeaway, what you learned maybe, or what you appreciated in regard to playing with those guys?
Well, I think, like you said, Goose, I mean, and I would include you in that category as well. And, um, you know, I mean, obviously we had really good, really talented players, and we had a good team. And, you know, we had back-to-back Hobey Baker winners. And then the following year, Brett Hull and myself were both nominated. So we had, you know, we had some good players. And, but I think the one thing that you know, that when I look back years later is that just kind of the way we played, it was a very unselfish team. You know, it just felt like that we played the game the right way. It was never about, you know, individual stats. It was just about winning games and playing the right way. And I always felt that it was just a really unselfish team, almost to the point where we made sometimes one too many passes because everyone was so unselfish. There was never a situation where it was like, you know, oh, this guy's got to score. We got to get him to go. It was just played hockey. And, you know, we had a guy, a 700 goal NHL scorer, Brett Hull, and he was no different than anyone else. He played the game the same way that everyone else did. He was incredibly unselfish. And that didn't get noticed because he was such a phenomenal goal scorer, but he was an unselfish player. And our whole team played that way. And we had, you know, Bill Watson, the Hobey Baker winner, who scored, I mean, his junior and or sophomore and junior season, he had, I think he had like almost 200 points in 2 years of college hockey. I mean, it's just incredible. But same thing, very unselfish. And you know, you'd think when you have players like that who put up a lot of numbers statistically, you would be like, okay, they're a little selfish players. But I never felt that. I always thought we were really unselfish, and I thought we played the game the right way.
Awesome. So we'll get off of the college area in a second here. But one thing I thought was interesting was, um, you know, we talk about power play. If everybody stopped working on power play in practice, we'd have some better hockey players. But with that said, can you tell us a little bit on how the power play evolved and kind of the things that you guys look for in your practice?
You mean like back at UMD when we
Yeah.
were there? Well, you know, I'd have to look it up, Goose, but I think one year, I think we almost finished 36%. It was some ridiculous number. Now, obviously, you know, goaltending wasn't the same then as certainly as it is now. And the video and the amount of preparation and stuff like that to defend is a lot different today than it was then. But we actually started out, and I would say it was towards the end of my freshman year, that at the end of practices, we started playing this game. We used to call it the AHL, the Afternoon Hockey League. And basically it was, as soon as practice would end, there would be like 4 or 5, and it was usually the 4 or 5 the better players on the team. And we would go down to one end of the ice, and we loved because we'd take our helmets off, shoulder pads off, put these jerseys on, and then we'd play the poor freshmen or the guys that didn't get, you know, the guys that weren't on the lineup, and we'd make them come down and we'd play against those guys. And it was basically, you know, 4/5 of the power play was out playing this AHL game. And you know, we talked about this years later, Tom Curvers and Watson and myself, and it was playing those little in zone 3-on-3 game. We split, basically, if the other team got the puck, they had to go outside the blue line before they could come in and score. And so we just play in the zone, and you know, it seemed like we developed such chemistry, such little give and go plays and all this little stuff that we did this for like a couple of years, basically after every practice. And it seemed like that really helped us, just kind of translated into the game. We just had this instinctive awareness of where everyone, you know, how the guys were going to react. And it was all sort of just based on this little 3-on-3 game that we used to play. And we used to feel bad because it was like the third string goalie would have to go in there every day and he'd take a beating. And then, the poor guys that didn't get to play, or they were freshmen. And, we used to hand it to them pretty good, but it really helped us with, on a couple of things. One, it helped us just sort of the chemistry, but also it was great for those guys that weren't playing because it made them feel a part of the team. It made them feel like they just weren't, an extra player. They were part of this too. And so looking back at it years later, it was something that just happened, but it's something that was very beneficial for us.
Okay, Norm, I'm starting to get some questions coming in here. Changing gears a little bit. Coachable is a term used often to describe players. Now, as you moved up through the ladder in pro hockey, were there less and less uncoachable players, or even at the NHL level, those types of players are still there? Question mark.
Well, I guess it's what your definition of coachable is. I mean, so I have not seen really any, I didn't experience it, situations like that where players, they say, are uncoachable. To me, sometimes in coach speak is that uncoachable players are just players that maybe lack hockey sense. So they don't read the game, think the game the way that the coach wants them to do it. From that standpoint, they might say they're uncoachable. But in terms of, if you're talking about like sort of bad personalities, or just don't want to listen to the coach or whatever, I really didn't see a whole lot of it as a player. Didn't really see any of it as a coach, and haven't really experienced it in Chicago in the management position. And certainly in my position, I'm dealing with the coaches on a daily basis. So the only sort of uncoachable thing that you hear about is just a coach questioning a player's hockey sense and not being able to understand the game plan or whatever it is he's trying to implement. That's more than anything that I ever hear about.
So with that said, you just talk about role acceptance a little bit at the NHL level.
Well, I think it's critical for players. I mean, there's only so many Connor McDavids and Patrick Kanes, and those guys are so rare. For a lot of players, the difference between the American League and the NHL is just finding out what it is that you're going to do to stay in the NHL and be willing to accept that role. And there's a lot of guys that, for a number of reasons, it's hard for them to do. If you grow up, if you're a scorer all the way up from the time you start playing hockey right through high school, college, and even in the American League. But, if you're in a position where, you might be a skilled right winger, but if there's two guys ahead of you in the depth chart and you're not going to take their spots, well, how are you going to make it in the NHL? How are you going to get in? And you've got to figure out a way. And sometimes players have to accept that role. And some guys are more than willing to do it. And suddenly they'll change their game and become a penalty killer, checker, whatever it is. And they'll have successful careers in the NHL. And other guys, they struggle mentally with that. And for whatever reason, they're just not quite at that level as the elite players. And they can't seem to ever get their foot in the door because they're stuck to this is the way they want to play the game versus the best way that they have a chance to make it in the NHL. And sometimes it just doesn't happen for whatever reason.
Good answer. Moving on, what would you say, and you don't have to, these don't have to be exact, but what are some of the best attributes or some of the biggest attributes that you look for in a player, to play for the Chicago Blackhawks?
Well, I think, I'm not going to speak for the organization. I just kind of speak for myself. This is kind of like what I look for. I mean, every organization's different. Every scout, general manager, everyone's has their own ideas and so forth. But kind of what I do look for is, and again, this is very subjective, but first thing I look for is hockey sense. And again, it's how do you define hockey sense? It's very difficult. no one has the same definition. Everyone sort of has their own opinion on what it is. So it's a very subjective subject, but that's really what I look for. I mean, I think, you can go to a junior game, a college game, and you can watch the warm-ups, and you can pretty much tell who can skate and whether or not a guy's got decent puck skills. You can handle the puck and shoot the puck. You can watch that in warm-ups. But what you really, to me, what I really try to look for is obviously the hockey sense, the competitiveness of a player, and then sort of the mental toughness, which again, that's something you're not going to be able to see over one game. That's going to take some time to try to figure out. But it's really the three critical things that I look for, because I mean, anyone can go to a practice, warm-ups, whatever, and you can tell who the good skaters are, and you can tell who the guys that can stick handle and shoot a puck. But it's how you play the game. And that for me, the hockey sense is sometimes you have to watch a guy 3-4 times before something clicks and you go, okay, he's got it, or I'm not quite sure. But that's, again, it's very subjective. Everyone has a different opinion on it. And that's what makes scouting so difficult.
Norm,
So-
do you do much analytics on that for those players with your scouts, or is it mostly your scouts? And
No, we are on the amateur side. We do, certainly on the amateur and pro side, we do. And I think analytics, there's some good stuff there's with analytics, but the issue, a little bit of an issue that I have is with analytics is sometimes you're not always comparing apples to apples, and sometimes you're comparing apples to oranges, and so it's not really necessarily a fair comparison. And so what I mean by that is so if we're doing it for the amateur scouting, you might have, it's how can you rate analytically a kid playing, say, in, I don't know, Thief River Falls, Minnesota, versus a kid playing in Russia, or a kid playing in the Ontario Hockey League, or someone out west. You can't, it's almost impossible to do, because the level of competition is so dramatically different. So from that standpoint, it's something that you got to be really careful of. Obviously, if you have a tournament where you have all the best players, okay, then you can certainly look at the numbers and see how the best players at a U18 or World Junior, how they did against each other. You can look at the numbers that way. But to try to do it for most of the kids for the draft it's really almost impossible, because, like I said, the level of competition each are playing at is just could be so dramatically different. So from that standpoint, I think it's you've got to be very careful how you use it.
And on the draft side, this is just interesting. How many people do you usually list out, and how does that all work out from the draft? Like, you're going in with this huge list. I think that's just, crazy to think about how many kids that you guys have to scout throughout, and then you identify them. It's just cool.
Well, the list starts out pretty big, but by the time we get to the draft, you'd be surprised. It probably gets down to about 70 names. Sometimes it's even a little bit less than that. And it's basically what we tell our scouts is, don't put the kid's name on the list unless you want to draft them. Like, just because, Central Scouting has him rated, or Redline Report has this guy rated at a certain spot. If you don't want to draft him, don't put him on the list. So that's why our list, it starts off in September, or those first meetings, either, I can't remember, usually in November, I guess. There's a lot of kids on there. There's a lot, but it gets, as the season goes along, it certainly gets whittled down. And then by, in a normal season, the draft would be in June. We would have our final meetings probably in May. And then again, we'd have one last meeting a couple days right before the draft. But usually by the time we get to the draft table, it's about around 70 names. And I remember the first time when I saw it like that, I was sort of like everyone else, like, we're going to run, we're going to run out of names, right? But surprisingly, we never have. So, because there's so many kids out there. And like I said, everyone has their own ideas, their own opinions on the type of player they're looking for. And so, we're going to have guys on our list that no one else will have, and vice versa. So it's just the way it works out.
So Norm, before I forget, we were talking the other day about there's maybe a little bit too much structure in the game today, and you're a real creative player when you played the game. But growing up in Thunder Bay, with that said, is there any coaching advice that kind of stuck with you over the years um, that you apply to your job today?
Well, it applied certainly when I was coaching. I had a coach when I played midget hockey in Thunder Bay. Now, midget hockey is that was grades 10 and 11. We didn't have high school hockey, or like I said before, we didn't have a AAA program. It was all house league. So it was 10th and 11th grade, and my coach had played briefly in the NHL, and this was something that at the time, looking back, never really realized it until years later. But he had played a little bit for the Detroit Red Wings in the early 1960s, and I think maybe he had played a couple of half seasons, something like that, with the Red Wings. So, as a 15-year-old kid, you're like, you hear about that, and you're like, okay, that's kind of cool, whatever. But years later, when I thought about it, it's like, back then there was only 6 teams in the league, and NHL teams only carried 5 defensemen. So you're thinking about, he was one of the best top 30 defensemen in the game. And if you think about the NHL right now, you think of who the 30th best defenseman in the league is, he's pretty darn good. He's making a lot of money. So my coach was, I obviously probably didn't think about it at the time, what a good player he must have been in his day, but he was just a great person, great coach. And he was a former defenseman, and he came up to me, it was my first year. So I would have been, I guess, in 10th grade, probably 14 or 15 years old, I guess 15. And he came up maybe about a month into the season. He came up to me one day in practice, and he just said, look, I've been watching you play, and you're a smart player. And he said, if you make a mistake, he goes, I know you're going to figure it out. He says, if you make the same mistake twice and don't figure it out, he says, I'll say something to you, but otherwise just go play. And I've always, that's always just kind of stuck with me. It's like, it's like, he just gave me that freedom to just go play. And, and I kind of, when I got into coaching, I coached for 6 years. I coached in the American League first, and then I was an assistant in Boston for a few years. And I always kind of try to use that same approach that, these guys, they make a mistake, they're going to, if they don't see what the mistake they made, if they don't figure it out, if they don't realize it, then I'll say something. But otherwise, I just wanted to let, most 90% of the time they knew that they made a mistake. And as long as they didn't do it again, I knew that they were going to make sure that didn't happen again. So I've always tried to just kind of have that philosophy to just let guys go play, and the freedom to play, and not worry about making mistakes. Because to me, that's the worst thing. And, when you see it now in my position in management, you certainly, you see it a lot especially with young players. You can tell the guys that are playing loose and free versus the guys that are just so afraid of making a mistake. It almost paralyzes them when they go on the ice. And that's certainly the last thing I ever wanted to do when I was coaching. I didn't want anyone to sort of feel that fear of making that mistake, and just go play. It's a reactionary game, and you have to react. And so if you're thinking about making a mistake prior to that, you're not going to be able to react in a positive way.
So with that said, Norm, we were talking a little bit about hockey sense and situational practice, the transfer to game. So you're not necessarily can teach hockey sense, but you can prepare your players in that regard. You want to discuss that a little bit?
Well, I've always thought, I've always wondered, I'm like most people, I'm a fan of all sports, and obviously, I like football, baseball, basketball, and I've always kind of wondered. It seems like whether it's reading books or just kind of watching videos or whatever of other sports, and just like even HBO has that training camp thing that they had for years about the NFL team. They follow them around. And I've always wondered about, in hockey, I never experienced as a player, and even as a coach, I always sort of wondered why we don't work on situational play that much. And what I mean by that is not the power play, not a breakout, but sort of okay, you're up by a goal with 4 minutes to go. okay, we're going to split the team. We're going to make best players go against each other, and we're going to see how everyone reacts. And you're going to play the last 4 minutes. One team is going to be up a goal and the other is going to be defending, and put players in situations where they have to react, and use that as a coaching tool. And there's a lot of times, most practices, the first 20, 25 minutes are all skills, skating, passing, shooting, stick handling, whatever. And then it seems like after that, it turns into, one-on-ones, two-on-ones, three-on-twos, power play, penalty kill, and you're done. And, in the NHL, they don't have the time. They just don't have the time to be able to do something like that. But I always wondered why at lower levels, college, high school, maybe Bantam might be a little too low, but certainly high school and college, where and you get that opportunity, you get so much more practice to game time. Use that working on situations where coaches can really get a real feel for players and how they want to handle situations versus just doing standard regroups and 3-on-2s and breakouts. Put them in an environment where it's competitive, but it's fun competitive, but it's also can be a real teaching tool. It seems like it's something they do in other sports, whether it's football or basketball. I just never seen it in hockey, and I've always wondered why.
And you hear that often with a lot of other sports, soccer and all these sports around the world. It's providing that environment and putting the pressure in different things that you can constrain, or there's that scoreboard effect. You can give points,
Right.
additional points for doing something good on one team, and putting that fake pressure. We talked about it the last few weeks on some of the webinars that that's a good thing. We had a tennis psychologist on. He was talking, how do you put pressure into tennis, right? You're just playing, there's no audience. He's like, hey, this point could be 40 points for a first serve, and somehow come up with ways that you build that pressure in somehow by manipulating the players there, or any of those effects. I think that's a really important part, and that's game like realistic, right? Compete levels high.
Oh,
Hey, Normie.
absolutely. Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. With that said, fun, competitive, even at the NHL?
Well, it's hard because your practice time is so limited, and the few practices you do get, the practice in the NHL level is more about recovery. It's not. It's really, the teaching is done in the video or on the board in the dressing room. It's not necessarily done on the ice because they just don't have the time. The amount of games, the travel, and then the mandatory days off per month that the players have to get. There's just not enough time to actually do that at the NHL level, I don't think. Just because you've got
Let me
to
interrupt you for a second there, Norman. Sorry. Maybe I misspoke, but what I had intended on saying essentially is NHL players, actually, it's important to have fun
Oh, absolutely.
at all levels.
Absolutely. I mean, they play that goaltender game. Our guys, ever since I've been here, they play that game at the end of the practice with the goalies, and it's like it's amazing how intense that gets. Can I tell you one quick story about? So when I was playing in Pittsburgh in the mid '90s, and I got a chance to play with Lemieux and Yager. I remember Yager was a pretty young player at the time, and he would, I mean, he had fun, and practices. I wouldn't say he was overly serious in practice, and in Pittsburgh they didn't really practice. The practices weren't real hard, but it was funny. As soon as practice ended, he immediately wanted to play 2-on-2 or 3-on-3 down low in the zone, because that's where he was really, and he would grab whoever would come play, and he would play these little 2-on-2, 3-on-3, and those things would be ultra intense and competitive. And it was like, this was his way of like, okay, this is what I really need to work on to be a great player. I need to be able to win these battles in the corners and take the puck to the net and give and go and all that stuff. And he would do that all the time. And it was just, I remember the first time I saw it, I'd never seen an NHL players sort of grabbing other guys and like, let's go play this little game. And he was the first one I saw it. And don't know how long he did that. I only played with him for about a year, and so did that continue? I don't know, but it was something that was pretty interesting that he took that sort of little game at the end of practice more competitively than maybe the rest of practice, but it obviously paid off. He had an incredible career.
It's just like the game that you played at the AHL after
Yeah.
Minnesota-Duluth, very similar where, it's super fun. You love it. Or the players love it. And that's how you're going to get better. And that's where you're going to go longer than just, your standard pass here, pass there, boring practice, like that's.
I gotta tell you, Dave, we would look forward to that. So our coach, Mike Sertich, he was ahead of his time. Guy and I have talked about, he was ahead of his time in terms of conditioning. And on Mondays and Wednesdays, he would literally bag skate us, Goose, for an hour. Like he just bag skate us every Monday, Wednesday for an hour. And still, we would just be like, as soon as that hour was, we just head in the dressing room, get our helmet and shoulder pads off, get that jersey on. We just couldn't wait to go back out there and play our little AHL game because, like you said, it was so much fun. It was competitive, and we didn't know it at the time, but we were developing that chemistry that really made a difference for us as a team.
That's awesome.
It's
I gotta
similar
take
like
some
those.
questions here, David.
Sorry, I was just saying it's similar like other sports. You hear about people in football or soccer in other countries. They're playing on the street, and that's their practice, and they become so good and so unbelievable because they're doing these little games, just on their own, and it's not as much what you do as a coach, right? It's their own ownership and.
Well, I was telling Goose this story earlier today. Like when I was in high school, Thunder Bay, obviously, because of the climate, we have a lot of outdoor rinks. So I had that advantage of being able to use outdoor ice. And so whenever I wanted, obviously in the wintertime, but I looked forward to Saturdays more than anything when I was in high school, because on Saturday afternoon, there was about 5 or 6 of high school teachers of my school who would come and we'd play shinny on Saturday afternoons on the outdoor rink. And I was just like, that was awesome. That was like the best thing. It was like, there would be like maybe 15 players out there, but 5 or 6 of them would be teachers from my high school. And it was like, that was awesome. It was the coolest thing. And, they were, at the time, they were probably only in their mid-20s, maybe late 20s at the most. But just still to go out there and just play shinny hockey, 15 guys, 1 puck, let's go. We're going to play 2 teams, and we just played. And it was absolutely, couldn't wait for Saturday afternoons to go out there with the teachers.
Awesome memories. Norm, got to take one question here. Would love to get your thought on evaluating players, including goalies, in an open tryout format. Outside of the usual hard skills, what are some of the other qualities you try to look at, and how do you go about structuring the sessions to test it?
Whew.
Yeah.
That's a tough question. First of all, I'll say this on goalies. I know nothing on goalies. I don't pretend to know anything on goalies. So I just leave the goalie stuff to someone that does, because that's, for me, that's an area I just don't know enough about. So I don't even pretend to try to know.
We had Peter Aubrey. We had Peter Aubrey on a couple weeks ago, and he was terrific. And if you haven't watched it, the people on YouTube or wherever you're watching this, he was very, very good, and he was very real life with all the goalies and the people watching. So he was a good one, good hire.
Yeah, well, Peter's he's a good guy, and he's done a really good job for us. He mostly works with our goaltenders in Rockford, our American League team, and he also works with our prospects that we've drafted are either playing college or, well, actually they're basically playing junior. He doesn't really have access to the college goalies, but yeah, he's done a terrific job for us. But in terms of the open tryout, boy, that's I just remember, oh, it was probably about 7 or 8 years ago, and my son, who after high school, he tried out for a few different North American League teams, and I remember going with him, and there was probably 80 to 100 kids there, and it was like, I was thinking, like, how do they evaluate this? I think that's really difficult. obviously to try to do it in a couple days is very difficult. That's a really hard question. I'm really not sure I have an answer for that when you have an open tryout with that many kids. Obviously, I think you need a lot of evaluators. You need the input of the people that are on the ice working with the kids. Obviously, I think the people that are on the ice might have a better understanding and better idea of who, you know, who the kids are versus somebody trying to evaluate from the stands. So maybe it's just, you know, the people that are on ice, having more people on ice so that you get a better feel for really what's going on down there. It's a good question though.
So kind of off of that, I think a player from somewhere on YouTube asked, question for the young Norm. You are a young player and a few teams want you. Which would you choose and why? And how do you go about maybe choosing some teams? That's a pretty good question.
Choose like who I want to play for?
Who would you want to play for? What would you look for in teams that you are being asked to play for?
Well, yeah, that's a really good question. It would probably be what would suit my strengths and you know, and play a style that would suit the way I play, and also probably an organization that is a, you know, that the accepting of someone that's you know, obviously a smaller defenseman. They're not afraid of putting a smaller defenseman in the lineup. So that's kind of what I would have to look at. And the other thing would have to obviously be opportunity, and you know, where the opportunity is, but also where the best fit is. And you know, I did have that situation coming out of college. I was a unrestricted free agent, and so I did have actually two teams that were very interested in signing me. One was the Edmonton Oilers, and one was the New York Rangers. And you know, the Oilers at the time, that was Wayne Gretzky and Mark Messier, Paul Coffey. It was right in the middle of their dynasty, their 5 Stanley Cups in 7 years. It was right in the middle. And looking back, I ended up signing with the Rangers because the opportunity was there. But looking back on it now, I ended up playing for the Oilers a few years later. It probably was it probably would have been the better fit for me at the time, but I didn't realize that the most important thing was the fit. And I went for the opportunity. And you know, I think if I had to do it over again, I mean, I enjoyed playing for the Rangers. I had a great time there, but you know, it would have been pretty cool to play on that Oiler team with Gretzky and Messier. And I did get to play with Messier and a few of those other guys, but that was at the end of the dynasty. But I think fit is probably more important than anything else.
Norm, again, I think we're getting close to wrapping up here, but you've had a chance to work with some great coaches and managers over the years. Can you name one or two of them and explain why they were so great?
Well, you know, I've been around. Well, I got a chance to work obviously with Mike Sullivan, and when we were together in Boston, and Mike has gone on to win a couple Stanley Cups with the Penguins, and obviously being around Joel Quenneville for, I guess, I don't know, 12 years in Chicago, and you know, the other person being around in Chicago was Scotty Bowman. Scotty works for the team as a senior advisor, and you know, Scotty, especially when we had those deep playoff runs, he was there for all the playoffs, and so you know, you get a chance to spend a lot of time with. I got a chance to spend a lot of time with Scotty, and I think the one thing that I kind of really learned, maybe that I didn't quite know when I first got into coaching, certainly in the NHL level, was that, you know, at that level, and I'm sure it is you know, when you're trying to win at whatever level, but it's really understanding your best players, understanding what your best players do and how do you get the most out of your best players. And then it's more that you've got to tailor what you're doing to maximize the results from your best players. If you're trying to fit them into what your system is, might not work. But what I learned from watching Joel, from listening to Scotty, and certainly seeing the way Mike is the way he's doing things in Pittsburgh now, you maximizing your best players. To me, that's what it's all about. And I don't know if I quite understood that when I first got into coaching, and certainly even in the NHL. But you don't you look at what you have, and then you try to take what you have and make the absolute best of it. You don't necessarily, a lot of coaches have these ideas of systems that they're going to play and they're going to implement. And you'll hear it, a new coach is hired, and you'll watch the press conference, and the first thing he says is, well, this is the way we're going to play. Well, that's great, but what if you don't have the players that can play that way? It makes things a little difficult. So with these two guys, especially Scotty and Joel, and just listening to them and watching them and being around it, is they've realized who their best players are, and they found a way to maximize their best players, because the rest of your team is going to, all of us have sat in a dressing room, who the good players on your team are, right? And that's what makes your team tick. Your best players make your team go, and the rest of the guys, they're just going to fall in the line. If your best players are playing it, everyone else is just going to follow along. So at that highest level, the coaches really needs to just focus, for the most part, on making sure that his best players are playing at their maximum potential. And if they are, then you're going to have a chance to be really successful. And that's what I witnessed in Chicago, and certainly listened to Scotty and gone back and watched some of his old tapes, and after things he said, and you're like, oh, now I know exactly what he's talking about. And it's obvious why they were successful.
Awesome. Student of the game. David, how we doing?
We're doing pretty good. If you have any questions, throw them in the Q&A. We're going to wrap it up here pretty shortly. But so I have a question for you, Norm. When you were working in player development, player personnel, and you were there to develop your players, how was that different from when you were a assistant coach, and was there a difference?
Yes, there's definitely a difference. So how I approached it, and how I think, this is just my opinion, how I think it should be approached. So at the NHL level, we draft these kids, and technically they're our property. The rare exception is signed right away and play in the NHL. They either go play in junior, or they go play college, or they're back to Europe and play. So I've always felt that you can't take away from where they are right now. Meaning, it's going to be a great experience, whether they're in college, whether it's junior, sweet, like that should be their focus. Their focus should be on where they're playing, their teammates, their coaches, everything. And from a organizational standpoint, our view should have been, at least the way I approached it, was that I'm just going to talk, when I talk to a player, I just want to give him long, sort of the big picture view on what he might need to do to be a successful NHL player. For example, I wasn't going to get into, hey, on the forecheck, you got to go this way, or, on the back, you got to back check harder, or you got to do this, or your stick position. I didn't want to interfere in any way with what the player's coach was doing. But if it was something that, look, you're 170 pounds, if you're going to play in the NHL, you've got to get in the next 3 years, you're going to have to put on 15 pounds, or or your conditioning isn't what it needs to be. If your body fat's a little high, like, look, you're going to have to take this a lot more seriously, nutrition wise. So it was always sort of big picture stuff, and not getting involved in their team, what their coaches were telling them, what they were working on, because I didn't think that was fair to their coaches, for one thing, and fair to their team. But I didn't want them to focus on, oh, here's what the Blackhawks are saying. I wanted them to just like, hey, you're a London Knight, or you're a UMD Bulldog, or you're a whatever, and that's what you should focus on. But oh, by the way, I'm just going to give you this piece of advice that, for you to have a successful NHL career, you're going to have to, at some point, you're going to have to like realize that this is what's going to have to happen for you to be an NHL player. And that's kind of the way I try to approach it. And I try to instill that with the guys that we have right now. Don't get involved in terms of what their coaches are telling their players, because you don't want to, that's the last thing you want to do. Just give them big picture strategy of what it's going to take for them to reach their goal of playing in the NHL.
That's good advice. That's interesting. on that. So Goose, we're going to wrap up, but usually before we go, I always ask our guests one question. I don't know if Goose has given you a heads up yet on this question. So he's trying to throw you a curveball. This is for all the times you put him in the corner to get that puck out. And you said just to stay out in front and just pass him the puck. So here it is. If you had a time machine to go back in time and ask a young Norm Maciver, when you first started coaching and kind of gotten on your journey on the front office side, what would you tell him that what you know now?
Ooh. Wow, Dave, that's a great question. What would I tell him? Oh, do what you love, stick with it, enjoy the process. It's like, it's an unpredictable business. You never know where it's going to take you. So just really go in there and enjoy it, have fun, work. And to me, more than anything else, this is a player's game. Let them play, give them what you need to give them, and then sort of get out of the way and let them go play and do their job. And dang, that was a good question. I haven't really thought of that before, but yeah, I think more or less just enjoy it. Don't worry about, where you are in the process, because you know what, you never know what's going to happen. I personally would never expected this for me. So you just never know. Just go have fun, enjoy it, work hard, and respect this great game that is that we're all get to be a part of.
Awesome. Thank you very, very much for your time, Norm, Goose, and really appreciate it. And hopefully we'll see your team soon in a couple weeks. That's what we're hoping. Everybody's hoping. We want some hockey. But
yeah, I hope so too. It'd be great.
That's a whole nother webinar to talk about. Anyways, thanks again, everybody, for watching. And we're back next week, 3:30 all week, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Eastern time. You can watch all our recorded webinars on youtube.com/USA Hockey or on our ADM Facebook page, American Development Model, and follow at USA Hockey Coach. But thanks again. We hope you have a great weekend, and we look forward to seeing everybody next week. See ya.
Thanks, Dave.
Thanks. Trying to end it. Not coming up. 1 second.
Are we ended?